In the past, form validation would occur on the server after a person had already entered in all of their information and pressed the submit button. If the information was incorrect or missing, the server would have to send everything back with a message telling the person to correct the form before submitting it again. So this was a really lengthy process, and it is a lengthy process, and it tends to put a lot of burden on the server due to all the requests. So these days, JavaScript provides a number of ways to validate a form's data right in the browser before sending it to the server. So here in our editor, I have a basic form that accepts a person's username and also an email. Within our script tags, let us grab a few things from our form. So firstly, let's grab our submit button. So we want to get this element by ID. Submit btn. Now I am going to put together a function so that we can validate each one of these fields in the form. So I'm going to create a function called validate. And firstly, I am going to prevent the form from submitting. So I'm going to use the e.prevent default. And now I need to grab my username. And we're going to grab that field by its ID, and it has an ID of username. And we'll do the same thing with the email address. So it's going to be email hyphen address. And let me try to remain consistent here. So we're single quotes. So now we need to do a check to ensure that the values are empty. And if they're empty, then we do our first validation. So if our username dot value is an empty string, then we just want to give an alert to the user to let them know to please enter their username. Then we want to focus do a focus on that field again. So use the focus, and then finally we're going to return false. Right, so this return false will prevent the form from accepting that input if it's empty. And we're going to do the same thing with the email field. So if email address dot value is equal to an empty string, we're going to do an alert to please enter your email. And then we do a focus and return false. All right, so there's one more check that we would like to do on the email address value. So we're going to use what is known as a regular expression to validate our email. So let me define a function and let's call it email is valid. And this function will return a regular expression value, and we are going to test it against that email field. So I am going to copy and paste a regular expression that checks to see if an email input is valid. And I'm going to use the dot notation at the end and call the test function, and we're going to test that email value. All right, so now that we have our function, we can go back and do our check and say if the email address is not valid. So we need to call our function and put the email dot value. We're going to now do an alert. Say please enter a valid email address. And then we're going to focus on the field. So dot focus and return false. And now finally, we need to add an event listener to our submit button, right? So submit button dot add event listener, and our event listener will be a click, and we're going to pass in our callback function, which is the validate function, right, which we have defined right here. So now let us save this and test out our form. So let's refresh this, click on our form validation. So let's enter a username, my user, and if I try to submit, it will say please enter your email address. Click on OK. And if I enter my email address but do not have a username, it will say please enter your username. All right, if I have both, then of course the form will submit. So I do not get any type of feedback from that. So the final thing we will have to do is to give an alert to let our user know that, hey, the form has submitted. So usually we return true if the form is valid, but I'm just going to do an alert. So let's say form data will be submitted. Okay, so usually, as I said before, we would just do a return true, and once that returns true, the form data will be submitted. But we're not submitting to a server or anything like that. This is just a front-end validation. So let us just do an alert for the user. So let us save this. And let us submit. Or let's refresh first. So let's ensure everything works. Please enter your username, my user, if we have an email. And for instance, if this does not have a .com on it and we try to submit, it will tell us please enter a valid email address. And if it does have a .com but it does not have the @ it will tell us the same thing. So a valid email address should have an @ and a .com. So let's put that back and try to submit. And now we get our alert saying our form data will be submitted.